So, like I said during DPS, I wanted to cover syncing a Backbone app with the server this week. So we're going to take the basic Backbone example that I did 2 weeks ago and basically add server synchronization to it. Should be pretty straightforward. The PHP side of it, I'm going to keep as simple as possible, so there won't be any dependencies involved. We'll just do PDO for the database, and we'll grab the information we need from Backbone on our own instead of pulling in a framework or WordPress or anything like that. So I'll go ahead and dive in. Again, we're just doing same example code that we had 2 weeks ago. So we've got our main index.html, which I don't think we'll have to change at all. Our app.js, which is our own JavaScript, and then a vendor folder that has Backbone and its dependencies that we're going to use to run everything. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to modify our app.js file so that it at least starts talking to the server, even though we haven't implemented what we need to make that work correctly. So the first thing I'm going to do is in my model, I'm going to tell it what we call our ID field in our databases, because we don't just call everything ID for our primary keys. We actually say like fruit ID. So I do that by just saying ID attribute is equal to fruit ID. I'm also going to adjust my isDelicious field here to match the style that we generally use for database columns. So we'll make isDelicious separated with an underscore instead of camel cased. And then this is the key part right here, is on the collection we're going to tell it what URL it should use as the base for all of its talking to the server. We're going to tell it that on our collection definition. So I'm going to say URL is equal to Backbone API fruits.php. So that's the actual script that's going to handle all the talking. Now this part here, where we're instantiating the fruit collection, this is where our data is coming from right now. So if we look back at our browser, we see that I've hard-coded these 3 fruits into the JavaScript. And the goal here is to get our data on the server side instead of hard-coded. So we're going to get rid of that initial data, and instead we're going to tell the collection to fetch its data. So that's going to send it off to the URL that we defined above, and Steve does not know what meeting to go into. So I'm going to send that to him real quick. So we've told it you need to go fetch the fruits from the server on line 56 there. And it's going to look at the URL from line 44, and we'll get into the details of how that works in a bit. The only other changes we're going to make to our app.js JavaScript are 2 weeks ago, we were just listening to when the name attribute was changed. And we're going to alter that so that we're listening to all events on the collection instead. So we want to know everything that's happening on the fruits collection. And then finally, I will get rid of this name change that I'm doing down here at the bottom, because we were just using that for demonstration purposes last time that we talked about this. So we'll get rid of that. And that's basically all the changes we need to make on the JavaScript side. So let's see what that does for us in the browser now. We should get an error because it's going to fail to get the data from the server. And we can see that here. We got a 404 when it did its request to the server. But let's look at what Backbone did so that we can get a feel for how the interface is working. In this case, when we're just doing a fetch, we can see that the request method is get, and the request URL is just the URL that we provided. When Backbone's communicating with the server, it does it in a RESTful manner. And practically speaking, that basically just means that it's using the semantics of HTTP to communicate what it wants with the server. So it's going to lean very heavily on the request method. So we'll see get, post, put, and delete request methods. So some of those are a little unique. You might not see put and delete in typical applications. And then also our request URL will sometimes just be this base URL, but at other times it'll have a slash and then an ID number after it. So it'll be /2/3, representing an individual record. And we'll see that when we're retrieving a single fruit, we're doing a delete, or we're doing an update. Okay, so now we've got Backbone trying to get stuff from the server. Let's go ahead and start implementing the server-side code. So because the URL we specified is api/fruits.php, we're going to create an API folder here and create our file inside that. Now, like I said, I'm going to do this as simply as possible, not using any dependencies or anything like that. So it's not going to use Zen Framework or WordPress. It's just, your very basic PHP style of pulling this off. So we're just going to point it to a Postgres database using PDO, which is a built-in PHP database driver. And we'll call our username and password both fruits on this database. And then this little bit here is a little clunky in PDO, but I'm basically just telling it when you get results, I want them as associative arrays instead of as numeric and associative arrays combined. That's the default in PDO, which kind of sucks. So that's our database connection. I'm going to go ahead and create this database now because I just realized I don't have one. So let's throw that into Postgres here. So we'll create a user named fruits with password of fruits, and then also make a database owned by that user. And then we'll reconnect as that user and just create one table. So we're just going to have our normal primary key, the name, and whether it's delicious or not, just like in our last example. All right, so now we've got our table. Now, there are three elements to a Backbone server request that are important to us. And that's the request method, the ID that might come at the end of the URL, and the request body. And that part's a little interesting. Like you're probably used to just pulling fields out of _post. So, like your super globals like you have in PHP typically. But when Backbone sends a request to us, so like a post to make a new fruit, it's actually going to send us the information as a JSON string. And we need to grab that from the body of the request and decode that JSON so that we can work with it. So we're going to have three elements that we're grabbing right up top here in our script. So the first is just the request method. So we can get that directly from server. That'll be get, post, put, or delete. Then we've got the ID, which, like I said, will sometimes be at the end of the URL. And we're expecting it to be an integer, so we'll go ahead and cast it that way just to be safe. And let's see, this is kind of a clunky way of getting this, but I'm just going to tell it to grab whatever is after the end of the URI. And that would be, let's see. So that'll get our ID if it's there. And then finally, we need to get that request body like I was talking about and decode the JSON in it. Now, we won't always have a request body, but if we don't, JSON decode will just return null. It's not noisy about it if it doesn't find valid JSON. So we're going to take advantage of that for this quick little script here. And then, of course, this second argument to JSON decode basically says, instead of using std class objects, when you're decoding that JSON, give it to me just as arrays, which makes it a little bit easier to work with, because there are a lot more functions for dealing with arrays in PHP than there are for std class objects, which are kind of useless. So those are the three elements we need to be able to process every request that Backbone is going to give us. Now we need to actually delegate these requests based on the method that we're receiving and this information we're getting from Backbone. So the first one we're going to do is just the very basic, give me the list of information. So we're just going to say if the method is get, then we're going to echo the result of a function called get all fruits. And in this case, the only thing we need to provide to the function is a reference to the database, because it's not going to have any variables in its output, really. So we're going to, in every case where we're interacting with the database with PDO, we're going to use prepared statements to avoid SQL injection. So in this case, we'll do select star from fruits ordered by name. And then we have to execute that prepared statement, and then we'll return its results encoded as JSON. So let's always exit after we do our processing there. So now we should be able to get a list of fruits, but of course we haven't added any to the database. So let's add a couple fruits so we have some test data. So we'll insert into fruits.
Hey, Brad.
Yeah.
Why do you have to execute the statement before you do a fetch all?
So basically a prepared statement is a two-step process. So this part here on line 19 is telling the server, hey, I'm going to run this query. And this part typically is where you would put parameters in. So if I had, let's say, where fruit ID equals fruit ID, then in my execute, I would say array fruit ID equals 2. So basically, this is the actual code that will be run by the server, and this is the data that code relies on.
Okay.
And
So
this
that's different from Zend DB select because of the way the statement is created by Zend.
Yeah, right. Zend is basically hiding some of this from you.
Right. That was I guess that was the point I wanted to make to the group. So.
Okay, cool. So now we've got some test data. We've got 3 fruits. And we've got a method for pulling those fruits into the client. So let's see if we've got everything working so far. There we go. We can see we've had an AJAX request here. Again, the request method is get. That's what we were relying on. The URL is exactly as we provided it to Backbone. And our response is that JSON with our result set from Postgres. So now let's expand this. We're going to support other HTTP verbs, which is another way that people refer to request methods. So we're going to add support for post here so that we can add new fruits from the JavaScript. So in this case, we'll call our function add fruit, and it's going to need the database connection and also the data from the request body so that it can do this insert. So add fruit. And this is going to be very similar to what we had here. But obviously we're doing an insert statement, so we'll do insert into fruits. And we're not going to do a lot of checking to see if things exist here and validating the information. We're just going to be kind of optimistic that we got good info from the client at the moment. And then when we're returning after an insert, we actually want to return the new data from Postgres in case triggers might have changed something. If nothing else, the ID is going to be set now because we've added a new row, so it should have a fruit ID. So we're going to send that back to the client in our response. So we'll need another function there to get fruit by ID. So let's go ahead and add that function as well. So we'll copy get all fruits and change it to get fruit by ID. And then we're going to just return that as JSON as well. So we're going to need I think that should do it. Let's see. So what I'm going to do to test this so that we're not spending time on the UI right now is I'm going to throw a breakpoint in here during our render method. And that's going to let me kind of watch things build piece by piece. So if I hit resume script execution here, we'll get the first set of data from the server. So we got apple, grape, orange. And now I'm in the middle of this method, so I can go ahead and play with whatever would be available during that part of the execution. So in this case, we're inside of our view object and its render method. So we can see that one of the variables I have available to me is this options fruits, which is my collection of fruits as a backbone object. So I'm going to use that to do additional testing. So I'm going to say this options fruits dot create, and we'll give it a name of, let's see, we'll do it cherry now, and hit enter, and we can see that it re-rendered as soon as I did that. So it added it to our list for us. And let me go ahead and we'll end the script here. And we can see that we have an additional AJAX request. So this was the initial one to get the list of fruits here. And this post is adding the cherry fruit. So in this case, we can see that we've now got our fourth fruit added on the server side. So just doing my create call allowed that to happen. So in the background, that kicked off the AJAX request and got everything set up on the server side. So that's basically our next verb in our PHP is the implementation of the add or insert portion of the protocol. And now we're just going to add two more verbs. Will be very similar. The first is going to be a put. This is our update method. And then our delete to actually remove a fruit from the server. And then if we see something that we don't expect, we'll throw an exception. So So in this case, we'll just do update fruit, and we're going to need, again, just the database and data. And then in the case of delete, we're going to pass it the DB and the ID property. We'll see that in the URL when we actually run that. So for the update, we'll start with our insert method as the base. And then we just need to add that additional parameter down here for the fruit ID. That's about it for the update, I think, yeah. We don't need to return anything from the update to make Backbone work. And then finally, the delete method.
Brad, you need a comma after the is delicious and irate.
I do need a comma. And that should be it for delete. Pretty simple. So we'll go ahead and fire things up again. Do the initial load from the server. Now let's do an update. So I can retrieve something from the fruits collection now by the ID from the database instead of having to use the client ID like we discussed a couple weeks back. So first I'm just logging the fruits collection directly, and we can see that it's got the 4 models inside of it. First one there is the apple, and we can see, it has name, apple, is delicious, true, and fruit ID of 1. Now because we've told our fruit model that its ID attribute is going to be fruit ID, it knows when I'm calling the get method to use that to retrieve things. So you can see I just said .get1, and that should get me my apple object again. Now I'm going to take that and set an attribute on it. So I'm going to say set watermelon. And if I did that right now, everything would still be on the client side, but a lot like Active Record or Zend DB table row, I can just call a save method at the end, and that'll tell it, send this over to the server in addition to doing it on the client side. So that returns our object again. We can see that our rendering updated immediately, so we didn't have to do anything UI-wise to make it reflect the model change. And then again, we're just going to skip all these re-renders to get to the end. And we see that we have an additional AJAX call here, and it's a put request this time. That's our update. We can see that it's sending these 3 variables along as the request body. And we can also see that it did throw the ID at the end of the URL. So we could have grabbed the ID either from the end of the URL or from the request body, which is what we actually did. And then let's go ahead and make sure we didn't mess something up in the PHP. Good, so we got the update. Fruit ID 1 is now watermelon instead of apple. So final step that we'll do is we'll do a delete to actually remove a row. So we'll skip our breakpoint to get the initial data. And now let's just get that same 1. So we'll say this.options.fruits.get1.destroy. So again, rendering updated automatically. Go ahead and skip to the end of the execution. And we see that our network tab now has the delete request in it. Again, the ID available on the end of the URL, which Backbone is doing for us. And then looking in the database, that row is gone. So that's pretty much it. As you can tell, it's very simple to implement this API in PHP. When you're in Zen Framework, they've got some utilities to help you with this. They've got what's called a RESTful controller that you can use that will automatically delegate to different methods based on the request method. In WordPress, it's roughly like this. There's not a whole lot of utilities to really help with it at this point. But in the next release, they're supposed to have some REST utilities built in that'll make this a little bit easier to do in a repetitive way. But I think you can tell just looking at this that, this is the only logic you really need to support Backbone on the server side. So it's not that complicated. You can get it set up pretty quickly. And then the database side is, your just standard CRUD stuff. Once you have this server-side bit set up for CRUD on whatever your API endpoint is, so in this case, like Fruits, the JavaScript looks almost exactly the same as having stuff hard-coded on the client side. You really don't have to think much more about it in the Backbone code than we did 2 weeks ago. It's just going to automatically call this sync method in the background and do those AJAX calls for you. So it's pretty straightforward. I'll throw this in Basecamp if people want to play with it a little bit. But otherwise, I think that's it, unless people have questions. All right. Well, I will just throw this in Basecamp.
What situation would you use this instead of Zen? Hey, Brad.
The PHP part.
Brad.
The PHP part that I'm doing here, I was just trying to show it as it would be in stripped down PHP.
Okay, good.
But obviously there's nothing interesting about it, which was kind of my point. Like, a lot of people assume when you're doing something with like a JavaScript library like Backbone or Ember.js that you need a big complicated framework on the server as well.
Right.
But it's really straightforward. I mean, it's like as simple as can be, really. Like, just very basic database interaction. You certainly can make it a little bit prettier with Zend, but there's no need for it necessarily.
Right. Plus, it handles all the. It's just updating the. It's handling the REST manner. It's actually updating the browser there for you without any of that code being there, which is nice.
Right. That's all the Backbone side, which is so much better than the typical way that we do JavaScript. Like, it's basically just the data is completely separate from the UI, and the UI just knows whenever the data changes, I need to reflect that. So
Right.
very, very simple. But yeah, getting it actually tied to a server is straightforward. It's just implementing these 4 verbs in HTTP. So as long as you do that, you can have very interactive JavaScript applications that save their data on the server instead of losing it as soon as you refresh the page.
Are we using this anywhere?
This will be used on the TimeKit UI, so that debugger that I was talking about with you earlier, and also it's used for the form editor in DoGooder, which I've recently started working on.
Gotcha. Good to know.
But yeah, I expect any kind of complicated thing we do in JavaScript from now on, we'll be using a lot of this stuff. So we would have used it on TitleNet in a few places if we had been up to speed on it at that time.
Yeah, I can see how this would be extremely useful in several places.
Yeah.
Especially when I'm doing those dashboards and stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Any other questions?
Since this is Backbone is shipped with WordPress now, I would imagine us using this a lot with Dewdrop, kind of like the calendar thing we did for CPAC, that type of stuff.
Yeah, I think so. I think the WAEES stuff might have some uses for Backbone in it because it's a fairly interactive interface up front. But yeah, that's a great point to reiterate that this Backbone ships with WordPress now. So if we're going to do anything that's like a nice client-side user experience and a WordPress project that's going to most likely be using Backbone on top of jQuery. So it's good for everybody to be aware of.
Cool.
All right.
This is great, Brad. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Like I said, I'll post the notes again in Basecamp in the next day or two. And yeah, just let me know if you guys are playing with this and have any questions.
Sounds good. Thanks.
All right, later.